Frederic Tudor shipped 80 tons of ice through the tropics on an unrefrigerated cargo ship, convinced half the world that cold drinks were a basic necessity, and built the largest food monopoly of the 19th century before any government realized what was happening. This was at a time when ice was more expensive than meat, a time when hospitals depended on a single man to keep their patients alive, a time when the temperature of a drink determined who had power and who didn't. And there's one detail almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. The ice that reached the bars of Boston, the hospitals of New Orleans, the mansions of Calcutta, that ice carried something beyond cold. It carried cholera. It carried typhoid fever. It carried the pathogens of industrial lakes where factories dumped their waste. The same industry that sold the relief also sold the disease. And it did so for decades, knowingly, because any alternative would have destroyed the business. This is not a metaphor about capitalism. It's what literally happened. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Ice King before? To understand how one man came to control the temperature of the world, we need to go back to where everything begins, not with Tudor, but with the problem he solved before anyone understood there was a problem. In 1841, physician John Gorrie was working in a hospital ward in Apalachicola, Florida, during a devastating yellow fever outbreak. His patients were burning at 104 degrees, with no mechanical ventilation, no air conditioning, no form of refrigeration whatsoever. Gorrie did what any desperate doctor would do. He hung containers of ice from the ceiling of the ward so the cold air would drift down over the sick. The method worked. The problem was that the ice arrived in blocks shipped from the north, traveling weeks by sea, costing a fortune, and arriving on the supplier's schedule, not on the schedule the patients needed. The supplier was Tudor, and Tudor didn't ship ice to hospitals in southern Florida out of generosity. To understand what Tudor built, you need to understand what existed before him. And what existed before him was literally nothing. Ice was a climatic accident, a gift from winter for those who lived far enough north. Ancient Persians stored mountain ice in chambers called yakchals, thick-walled structures buried in the ground, designed to let cold air pool at the bottom while warm air escaped through the top. They understood something that would take centuries for physics to formalize. A large mass of ice melts proportionally slower than a small one, because volume grows faster than surface area. A block of ice the size of a house loses heat far more slowly than 100 hand-sized cubes. That's not intuition, it's geometry. And the Persians were using it around 500 years before Christ. Tudor read that geometry as a business opportunity. In 1805, Frederic Tudor was 21 years old, came from a wealthy Boston family, and had an idea that everyone around him considered clinically insane. His brother had traveled to the Caribbean and suffered terribly from the heat. Tudor heard that and thought, the lakes of Massachusetts freeze every winter. The Caribbean never sees ice. If I can move one to the other, I'm selling something that exists in abundance here to a place where it doesn't exist at all. Investors laughed. Boston newspapers ran pieces mocking the young man who wanted to melt money in the Atlantic. Their logic was simple. Ice melts. A 3-week voyage under a tropical sun would end with a ship full of water. The business was physically impossible. Tudor ignored all of them. He chartered a brig called the Favorite, filled the hold with 80 tons of ice blocks cut from the frozen lakes of Charlestown, insulated the cargo with sawdust, a material that was abundant, cheap, and surprisingly effective as thermal insulation, and set sail for Martinique in January of 1806. Half the ice arrived. The other half had turned to water, but half was enough to prove the point. The problem now was something else entirely. Martinique didn't have a single ice house. Tudor tried to sell the surviving blocks at the dockside, under the Caribbean sun, and watched everything he'd transported at such cost melt within hours. He lost money. He went back to Boston, and he began planning the second attempt. What happened over the next 2 decades is a lesson in what separates an entrepreneur from a monopolist. Tudor didn't just go back to the Caribbean. He arrived before the ice. He built warehouses at every port he wanted to dominate. He negotiated exclusive rights to sell ice in those cities with local governments. He'd arrive on an island, build the infrastructure, create the dependency, and then control the access. When competitors tried to enter the market, Tudor cut prices until any competition became unviable, then raised them again once the rival disappeared. It was predatory, methodical, and completely effective. But Tudor had a problem no warehouse could solve: demand. The Caribbean didn't know what to do with ice. There was no culture of cold drinks, no ice cream parlors, no habit. Tudor needed to create a market from scratch, and he realized he couldn't do it by selling ice. He needed to sell what ice made possible. So he went to every bar and restaurant in every city where he operated and made a simple offer. I'll give you ice for free for a month. You learn to make cold drinks, ice cream, chilled desserts. Your customers try them. After a month, you'll need to buy from me. It worked with surgical precision. Cold drinks created an experience so different, so superior to what people knew, that demand exploded within weeks. Tudor wasn't selling ice. He was creating addiction. And once the market existed, he controlled the only point of entry. By the 1820s, Tudor had also solved the harvesting problem. Nathaniel Wyeth, one of his collaborators, invented a horse-drawn plow with parallel blades that cut ice blocks to uniform size and thickness, an innovation that reduced the cost of extraction from 30 cents a ton to 10 cents. With lower costs and growing demand, Tudor began expanding into markets no one had imagined reaching. In 1833, a Tudor ship arrived in Calcutta with 250 tons of ice. A 4-month voyage, crossing the equator twice, passing through tropical zones that should, in theory, have melted everything. When the shipment reached the Indian port, the news spread across the entire city. The British colonial press described it as a miracle. Indians had never seen ice in their lives. Tudor sold everything within days. Over the following 20 years, Tudor accumulated approximately $220,000 in sales from India alone, a figure that today corresponds to tens of millions. His empire stretched from New England to Brazil, from Singapore to Hong Kong, from Australia to the Gulf of Mexico. By 1856, Tudor and his associated networks were moving more than 130,000 tons of ice per year. But what happened next, no one in the industry expected, because the man who depended most on that empire was about to destroy it. John Gorrie never stopped thinking about the problem. After 1841, he kept watching patients suffer while waiting for shipments that arrived late, arrived incomplete, or simply didn't arrive at all. In every letter he wrote, in every conference he gave, Gorrie repeated the same question. Why do we need to depend on climate to produce something as fundamental as cold? The answer lay in the physics Gorrie studied with obsession throughout the 1840s. He observed that when compressed air is rapidly released, its temperature drops. The principle would become known as the Joule-Thomson effect. Gorrie understood that if you compress air, cool that compressed air with water, and then allow it to expand rapidly, the final temperature will fall below freezing, regardless of where you are, regardless of what the climate is outside. His prototype worked like this: a piston compressed air to approximately 10 atmospheres inside a sealed cylinder. That hot, compressed air passed through a water bath that cooled it. Then the cold, compressed air expanded rapidly, and that expansion cooled it further, below the freezing point. The chilled air circulated around metal molds submerged in salt water, whose freezing point is lower than that of fresh water, and the molds produced artificial ice cubes. It was the first ice machine in history. Ice produced without winter, without a lake, without harvesting, without a ship. Ice that could be manufactured in the middle of summer, in the heart of the tropics, in any hospital that needed it. Tudor received the news with the clarity of a man who had spent 50 years building something that could be destroyed in an afternoon. What Tudor did next is the most revealing moment in the entire story. He didn't try to buy the invention. He didn't try to negotiate with Gorrie. He didn't try to incorporate the technology into his own empire. Tudor funded a campaign of systematic destruction against the Florida physician. Newspapers that Tudor controlled or influenced published articles ridiculing the artificial ice machine. Paid editorialists described Gorrie as a charlatan, a madman, a man trying to do what only God could do. The phrase, "playing God," appeared repeatedly. Not by accident, because Tudor knew that religious audiences in the 1850s would respond viscerally to that language. The campaign worked. Gorrie secured a patent in 1851, but found no investors. Every meeting ended with doors closed. The capital that could have funded mass production never came. Gorrie died in 1855, at 52. Probably of malaria. Alone, broke, unrecognized, having never made a single cent from the invention that should have changed the world. The Ice King survived another 20 years. Tudor died in 1864 as one of the wealthiest men in America, and natural ice kept arriving at the homes, hospitals, and bars of half the world. Here's what the industry knew and didn't disclose. The lakes from which the ice came were located in the industrial north of New England. The Industrial Revolution had turned those lakes into receptacles for sewage, factory waste, slaughterhouse runoff, and urban effluent. The ice harvested from those lakes carried the pathogens of the 19th century: cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery. When the blocks arrived at homes, placed inside the wooden iceboxes families used as refrigerators, and slowly melted there, the meltwater contaminated the food around them. Cholera outbreaks in American cities were traced back to natural ice distribution. Public health studies from the 1880s and 1890s documented the correlation. The ice companies knew, the distributors knew, and the business continued because the alternative, admitting the contamination, would have destroyed the market Tudor had built through decades of work. The irony is that this is exactly what saved Gorrie's invention. Not logic, not efficiency, not the superior physics of artificial ice. It was fear of disease. In the late 1870s and throughout the 1880s, artificial ice companies began using public health reports as marketing. Pure ice, produced without contact with contaminated lakes. The message was simple and terrifying, because it was true. Families who had watched neighbors die of cholera began paying a premium for ice that didn't kill. The transition was slow, but it was irreversible. Meanwhile, the impact of the Tudor system on the economic structure of the country had already become so deep that disappearing was impossible. Ice had reorganized not just how people drank, it had reorganized how a continent ate. The logic is straightforward. Before refrigeration, live cattle were transported by rail from Midwestern farms to slaughterhouses in eastern cities. The process was inefficient, brutal to the animals, and enormously costly. A steer transported alive loses weight during the journey. A steer slaughtered in Chicago and chilled takes up far less space and loses nothing. Gustavus Swift, one of the pioneers of the Chicago meatpacking industry, developed ice-refrigerated rail cars in the 1870s to transport processed meat. The resistance from Eastern meatpackers was immediate and fierce. They attempted to boycott Swift's meat, convinced the railroads to refuse his cars, and argued that old meat from Chicago was inferior to fresh local meat. Swift ignored the boycott, built his own distribution routes, and won. The economic logic was undeniable. In 1882, New York received 2,400 tons of beef per year. By 1886, 4 years after Swift's refrigerated cars began operating at scale, the number had reached 63,000 tons. The price of meat in American cities fell 39% in a decade. Chicago, which in 1850 had 30,000 inhabitants, reached 1900 with 1,700,000. The city had become the food processing capital of the Western Hemisphere because ice made it possible. And the question nobody asked out loud was, at what cost? Ice harvest workers operated on treacherous surfaces with heavy tools in temperatures that could kill. Falls on the ice during harvesting were common. Hypothermia was a constant risk. The horses that pulled equipment across partially frozen lakes fell through regularly. The work was seasonal and violent, and the men who did it earned enough to survive until the next winter. No government regulated the harvest. No inspection verified the quality of ice before it reached people's homes. No law required the lakes to be kept clean. Tudor's monopoly had grown so fast in such a complete regulatory vacuum that public institutions simply had no tools to reach it. That is the pattern. It's not a peculiarity of ice. It's the geometry of private power when it moves faster than public power can track. James Harrison understood the technical problem that Gorrie had only partially solved. In 1851, working in Australia, Harrison identified the fundamental limitation of Gorrie's machine. It used air as the heat transfer medium, and air is a poor insulator. It absorbs very little energy per volume, making the process slow and energetically inefficient. Harrison introduced refrigerants. The physics behind this is elegant. When a liquid evaporates, it absorbs energy from its surroundings. It's the same principle that makes perspiration cool the skin. Sweat evaporates and carries heat with it. Harrison built a closed cycle where a fluid was compressed until it became liquid, passed through an expansion valve where it rapidly evaporated and absorbed heat from the surrounding environment, and was then compressed again while the heat was expelled. The cycle repeated continuously, extracting heat from inside a chamber and dumping it outside. Harrison's machine produced 3,000 kilograms of ice per day. It was commercially viable, and it didn't depend on winter, a lake, a ship, or Frederic Tudor. But it would take decades before the technology scaled down from industrial to domestic. The affordable home refrigerator reached the American market in wide distribution in 1927. In less than 20 years, from under 1% of American homes in the 1920s to 85% by 1944, the electric refrigerator had completely replaced the Tudor cycle. The Ice King had been dead for 80 years when the last delivery of natural ice was made to an American city. The final irony is this: the technology Tudor destroyed, that he slowly killed through an isolated doctor in Florida, was the very technology that would make ice available to every working-class family in the world. Tudor had turned ice into a luxury product and kept it that way for decades. Gorrie had discovered how to turn it into a universal utility, and Tudor had ensured that process would take another century. The impact of that delay is incalculable. Every cholera outbreak linked to contaminated ice in the years between 1855 and 1900. Every patient who died of fever because a hospital couldn't maintain adequate temperature. Every poor family that never had access to the ice wealthy families used to preserve food. The difference between a world where Gorrie thrives and a world where Tudor smothers him is counted in lives, not dollars. The consequences of the refrigeration cycle would spread far beyond anything Tudor or Gorrie could have imagined. Vaccines that need to be kept at controlled temperatures during transport. Insulin that allows diabetics to live. Blood stored before surgeries. The James Webb Space Telescope, which operates at temperatures near absolute zero to detect infrared light from the early universe. The Large Hadron Collider, cooled to below 2 Kelvin to keep its superconductors functioning. The MRI machines that diagnose tumors. All of it begins, in some measure, with a doctor hanging ice containers from the ceiling of a hospital ward in Florida because a monopolist controlled the only product that could save his patients. Here's what this story says about how power actually works. Tudor's monopoly was not built by force. It was built before there was a vocabulary to describe it as a problem, before regulatory agencies existed, before antitrust legislation existed, before the concept of a monopoly harmful to the public interest was something a government could articulate in legal terms. Tudor moved in a space where private power preceded public power, where a company could control an essential resource, shape consumer habits, suppress innovation, and contaminate entire cities before any institution had the authority or the tools to intervene. And when the innovation that threatened that control finally appeared, the response was not competition. It was destruction. Tudor didn't need to ban Gorrie's machine. He only needed to make it impossible for it to find capital. He only needed to ensure that no serious investor wanted to associate themselves with the man Tudor had turned into a public joke. That mechanism doesn't age. The names change. The structure remains identical. Every generation has its own industries controlling essential resources before regulation can catch up. Every generation has its own inventors who threaten established monopolies and find that capital flows away from them with a consistency too unlikely to be coincidence. Every generation has its own newspapers and public voices that ridicule the wrong ideas for the right reasons. If you want to keep tracking how this mechanism repeats itself, subscribe. Every episode of this channel is a piece of the same puzzle. Give it a like if this story changed something in the way you see what you consume today. And tell me in the comments. Can you think of a current industry that operates exactly the way Tudor operated, controlling access, suppressing alternatives, and selling the problem right alongside the solution?